You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, transforming Scotland's energy sector. The largest ever auction of offshore wind farm permits gives the go-ahead for 17 new projects. From flooding to farming, a government assessment of climate risks says multiple sectors of the UK will be affected by even low rises in global temperatures. Lords debate the policing bill, which activists say would curb their right to peaceful protests at a critical time in the fight against climate change. And scientists arrive in Antarctica to assess the impact of climate change on penguin colonies. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, wind farm contracts worth £700 million have been awarded to energy companies to develop offshore schemes along Scotland's coast on what the First Minister described as one of the biggest, most significant days for the nation's energy and industrial future. In the country's largest ever auction of permits to develop the Scottish seabed, companies including Shell, BP and Scottish Power will provide low-carbon power while helping to cut emissions to net zero. So to begin with, almost 7,000 square kilometres of seabed will be leased for 17 different projects. Now, this will generate close to 25,000 megawatts of power. That's enough to power 18,750,000 homes. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon spoke to our business presenter Ian King about that announcement earlier today.
I mean, it's really hard to overstate how significant and important today's announcement is for Scotland's energy, environmental and economic future. I mean, this gives us the potential to meet our own energy needs from renewable sources. It's going to position Scotland as a major exporter of green energy, green hydrogen as well, and delivers massive economic benefits as well as the revenues that will flow to the Scottish Government. The estimate is that for every gigawatt of power generated from these projects in due course, there'll be £1 billion of investment in the supply chain, and that has the potential to create thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of jobs. So as we make this transition to net zero to meet the climate emergency, this helps ensure Scotland can do that in a fair and a just way that creates new jobs to replace those in oil and gas, for example, which we are in the process of transitioning away from. So this is perhaps one of the biggest, most significant days in terms of Scotland's energy and industrial future that we've had in a very, very long time. Really exciting. I mean, the impact on our marine environment, including fishing opportunities, is one of the things that will have to be carefully considered now as we move from today's announcements through the planning and consenting processes. So there's a lot of work ahead. I mean, our sectoral marine plan envisaged about 10 gigawatts of energy from offshore wind developments. The sum total of today's projects that have been given these lease options would be perhaps 25 gigawatts, so significantly in excess of that current planning assumption. Now, we want to maximise our opportunities here, but of course you're right to say there are other users of Scotland's precious marine environment. So making sure that all of this aligns will be one of the key challenges over the period ahead. But, you know, that challenge has to be seen in the context of the massive energy, environmental and economic opportunity that this represents for us.
Now, you touched just now on the decarbonisation of Scotland's energy industry. I just wonder why you're so opposed to the development of the Cambo oil field in West Shetland, given that it's surely more desirable for us to be having our own energy sources rather than buying it in from people like Vladimir Putin.
I don't favour anything that makes us more reliant on imports, and I certainly don't favour anything that, you know, would compromise people's jobs and livelihoods. But we face a climate emergency. You know, I'm here in Irvine, the town I grew up in, as it happens, not far from Glasgow, that just a matter of weeks ago hosted COP26. We all have an obligation, a moral obligation, to face up to the climate emergency. And for Scotland, the UK, countries across the world, that means transitioning away from fossil fuels. But we need to do that in a way that protects jobs, that protects livelihoods, that doesn't increase our reliance on imports. So that's a careful journey that we have to undertake. But Scotland, as today's announcement is really illustrating for us, is in the happy, fortunate position of not just having had oil and gas resources for several decades now, but also having this abundance of renewable energy resource.
Well, our business correspondent Paul Kelso joins me now. So, Paul, in the last month, around a quarter of our energy supplies come from wind. So how much difference will these contracts make?
In the long term, they'll make a very big difference. And no wonder the First Minister was so excited about this. She's right, this is a huge commitment to renewable, particularly wind, specifically wind power in Scotland. And it's going to net her government ultimately £700 million. This auction by the Crown Estate Scotland, who own the seabed, so they've leased this seabed for this use. The big technological shift here, which the First Minister didn't mention, is the bulk of these projects are floating wind farms for the first time. The majority, almost all of the wind power that's already generating, you say around a quarter of the UK's electricity supplies at the moment, is fixed. And there's a limit, ultimately, to the engineering, to how far offshore you can go once you are, as long as you are still tethered to the ocean bed. About 165 feet deep, about 30, 40 metres is the limit at the moment. Now, floating offshore wind opens up much greater distances offshore, where the wind speeds are much, much higher, and the North Sea is a savage place, extremely high wind. The more wind, the more power you can generate. So that's where the real dividend from this new technology will be. I spoke to Keith Anderson, the chief executive of Scottish Power, which has won 3 of these sites. It will do 2 of them in a joint partnership with Shell, of course, who have experience in the North Sea's last great energy boom, which was oil. And he said there is, he described this almost as a no-lose project.
So this is great for several reasons. Number one, it moves us away from volatile wholesale markets and gas prices. Number two, it delivers us closer and closer to net zero by 2050. And number three, it produces a fixed price for power at some of the lowest prices possible in the entire market. So renewable energy is cheaper, and it's the cheapest form of generation in the United Kingdom.
Now, this will take time to deliver. Work will start on these floating offshore wind farms in at the end of this decade, and could take up to another decade to be completed. But it's crucial if the UK is to transition fully to renewables and away from the source of this current anxiety about massively spiking energy prices, which is the reliance on gas, to bridge this gap between the decline of coal because of its carbon emissions and a renewable future. But the North Sea, once the source of all that oil, could soon be the source of wind power, which could power not just the UK, but much of Europe.
Paul, thanks very much indeed. So let's take a look now at some of the day's other climate news. And huge brands, including Coca-Cola and Nestle, are calling for an end to plastic pollution. The businesses have signed an open letter recommending a legally binding plastic treaty ahead of the UN's Environment Assembly Conference taking place next month. In practice, the treaty could end the leakage of plastics into marine environments within a decade. The House of Lords has been debating the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which has sparked Kill the Bill protests across the country. Campaigners have argued that without any changes, the legislation would curb the right to peaceful protest. Climate activist groups have said the bill will undermine the fight against climate change at a critical point. And we'll be discussing this with author and presenter Zaya Tong and lecturer in climate law at Edinburgh University, Navraj Singh Ghali. That's later in the programme. Now, the government's latest assessment on the risk from climate change identifies dozens of issues facing the UK, even if global warming is successfully limited in the decades ahead. Now, if temperatures rise by 2 degrees by the year 2100, the country could see farming, water supply and alternative energy supplies affected, as well as more flooding and a greater impact on public health. Now, it's estimated that this will cost the UK billions of pounds each year, And some experts are warning that temperatures could rise even higher by the end of the century by as much as 4 degrees. So let's take a look now at the current increase in global temperatures. And as you can see there, it's now at around 1.24 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Well, joining me now is the Chair in Climate Impacts at the University of Exeter, Professor Richard Best, who led the research that forms the basis of today's report. Welcome to you. First of all, has the government accepted in full your assessment of the risks facing the country as a result of climate change?
Yes, they've taken on board our advice. They've looked through all our very comprehensive assessment of these 61 risks, and they've completely accepted that these risks exist and need to be dealt with great urgency. So we welcome this report, which now recognises the urgency of the situation.
So just how prepared are we as a country?
Not at all, unfortunately. We've gone through all the different risks, which are, in actual fact, many of them are starting to come into play now. We've already changed the climate, as you just showed. We've warmed the world by over 1 degree Celsius. That is starting to play out in terms of impacts on severe weather. We're getting more severe heat waves, more heavy rainfall, which affects the flooding risk and so on. These are having an impact already, and more climate change is in the pipeline unless we can reduce emissions. But even if we reduce emissions enough to meet the ambitious decarbonisation targets, we'll see more warming and more severe weather and further sea level rise.
And the government has admitted, hasn't it, that it needs to do more. So what do you think the priority should be now?
So there's a number of priorities. One is clearly dealing with higher temperatures. All buildings basically need to be able to keep cool in summer. We're not used to that so much in the UK, so private residential properties. We hear a lot about the need for insulation to make them more energy efficient and keep them warm in winter, which is very important. But that would also help keep buildings cool in summer. So that's another reason to insulate private homes, but also other properties, schools, hospitals, prisons and so on. Everything needs to be able to deal with high temperatures, but also flooding. We need greater protection against flooding as well. We're seeing more heavy rainfall, and flooding is already having an impact increasingly often, so we need to do more there as well.
Lots to do. Professor Richard Betts, thanks very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you.
Now to the Antarctic Peninsula now, where researchers have arrived to study remote penguin colonies. Researchers travelled to the Antarctic Peninsula on a Greenpeace ship called the Arctic Sunrise. Scientists will be assessing the climate crisis impacts on penguin colonies after other groups in the area have collapsed over the past 50 years. Their arrival is in time for Penguin Awareness Day on Thursday, which aims to raise awareness for the conservation of the species' habitat. Now, do stay tuned. Coming up here on the Daily Climate Show, I'll be joined by author and presenter Zaya Tong and lecturer in climate law at Edinburgh University, Navraj Singh Ghali. And we're going to be discussing the policing bill and its effect on the climate protest movement. And is the global political and diplomatic system equipped to deal with the challenge of climate change? Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Now, we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with author and presenter Zaya Tong and lecturer in climate law at Edinburgh University, Navraj Singh Ghali. So, a very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So, first of all, the policing bill is being debated in the House of Lords today, and it's provoked much debate and indeed protest. The government stands accused of wanting to stifle peaceful protest with the legislation, which was proposed in part at least in reaction to Insulate Britain protesters disrupting commuters last year. So is this kind of legislation really a threat to peaceful protest? And how important is the role of protest in the climate context anyway? Navraj, to you first of all, what impact do you think this policing bill could have on future protests and on the broader climate movement?
Thank you. So this is a pretty intrusive piece of legislation that I think has been fairly poorly drafted and certainly hasn't had the opportunity for proper scrutiny. One of the risks of it is its huge breadth. The bill doesn't just deal with climate or environmental protesters, deals with matters such as road traffic offences, sexual violence, accessing information on electronic devices. So it's a massive bill, hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And one thing that means is that it's very difficult to scrutinise. And the Constitution Committee, if the House of Lords made exactly this point, has made the point before, but the government's ignored that advice. So procedurally, it's a bit of a dog's dinner. Substantively, there are some really challenging issues or approaches that the bill has taken. I think the first of these is that it has this, we're in the realm of public order here and peaceful protest. And it has this idea of a noise trigger. So noise triggers if there's that can be a condition which police officers can impose on a peaceful protest if there's a noise trigger. We know that protests are often noisy. People bang drums or they have PA systems and so on. And the idea that that can be the basis for restricting a protest, I think, is very troubling. And it's very likely that that will contravene either the European Convention of Human Rights or the common law, and most likely both.
Sorry to cut in. I just want to get some reaction from Zaya as well,
Sure.
Navraj. Sorry to interrupt there. But Zaya, we've got a real sense there, haven't we, of some of Navraj's concerns about it. But those who are behind this bill might say, well, yeah, we want people to protest, but disrupting the lives of people going about their everyday lives shouldn't necessarily be allowed. And this bill would toughen sentences for blocking motorways or other forms of transport, for example. There are going to be people that will support that, aren't there?
Well, there might be, but I think we have to look with a historical lens, and we have to realize that what we see as a nuisance today is often seen through the lens of history as something quite monumental for progressive change. So if I think of the suffragettes who were, tying themselves and chaining themselves to buildings and blocking traffic, I say, thank you. Because of you, I, as a woman, have the right to vote today. If I think of the Haymarket protesters who created a huge nuisance, thank you. Because of you, I only work 8 hours a day instead of 12. If I look at, for example, the Clayoquot Sound protesters who chained themselves to trees and created a huge nuisance for the logging industry, thank you. Today we have old growth forests. But even if you look from a geographic lens, when we look overseas and we see, for example, regimes, we look at, say, Russia or China or the Middle East, and we say they're quashing dissent and they're stopping their protesters, and we say that's totalitarian. Well, if it's totalitarian overseas, it's totalitarian at home as well.
Navraj, very quickly though, I mean, do they actually make a difference whether protests are peaceful or disruptive? I mean, they may make people talk about them, but certainly if they're stopping people going around their daily lives, it can put people off the argument, can't it? Very briefly, if you can.
For the avoidance of doubt, we're only talking about the realm of peaceful protest. There's nothing about disorder here. This is how issues get ventilated. As you just heard from the other guest, issues get ventilated in ways which are sometimes inconvenient, and inconvenience is a central part of peaceful protest.
OK, let's move on to our next topic, shall we, to try and squeeze another conversation in, because the government's admitted that it's not doing enough to adapt to the impacts of climate change. That's in response to a report from the Climate Change Committee. Now, the government was also recently accused of a lack of effective policy when it comes to reaching net zero targets. So can we rely on governments to do the right thing, not just here, but also internationally? Is the global diplomatic system equipped to tackle the climate crisis? So, Zaya, what do you think? Can governments be relied on? And if not, what's the alternative?
Well, I think that the incremental system change approach is certainly not working. If we look at almost 30 years of COPs, we're seeing a situation that is a much greater crisis today than when they started. The same thing, even if you're looking at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights for Indigenous People, there was legislation passed in BC, where I'm from, and still today we're not seeing accountability. We're not seeing meaningful change. We're seeing land defenders and water defenders being arrested by the RCMP, the police. We're seeing pipelines being built on unceded territory. We're seeing forests being raised. So we need to start thinking about a different type of system change. And, we always think, oh, system change, is that even possible? And we forget colonialism, fairly recent, was a form of system change. You had Europeans sweeping across the rest of the world, exporting a model, an idea that nature was inert and an object that you could go in there and you could destroy, exploit, extract, and bring it to market. And that is the system that has brought us the crisis, the climate crisis and the extinction crisis that we face today. So we need to learn from a more reciprocal model that we've seen from Indigenous people. So system change really starts with changing how we think about the system.
OK, Navraj, do you accept those arguments? Let's deal with COP in particular. Zaya saying that it's not effective. Do you think that's right? Because some might say that the last COP did see the big polluters coming on board with at least some new commitments and a commitment as well to come back later this year to be held to account. Do you agree with Zaya, or do you agree with those people who stand up for that form of diplomacy?
COP has a role. And its role is to set a set of broad standards and processes which have to address the climate crisis in a number of different ways. But it can't do everything. And I think the COP process through the Paris Agreement, which is flawed in a number of different ways, nonetheless sets some of those standards. Where the real deficit is coming is in national action and subnational action, corporate action. That's where we're really not seeing the follow through. So if you look at something called the Climate Action Tracker, which has a rating system of national actions, practically no northern states, which is what we're principally talking about, have a standard of action which is regarded as almost sufficient or Paris compatible. None do, in fact. The United Kingdom is the only country which is almost sufficient. Most of the rest of the global north is highly insufficient. So that's really where we need to see the action at that level, and corporates need to follow. All that was said about system change, I entirely agree with. There's no question that there is, in order to meet any form of meaningful climate action, there is a need of system change, which means a lot more than driving a electric car and eating less meat. It's fundamental changes to the way we produce and consume and exchange.
OK, and there's several hours' worth of debate to discuss how that will work, which we don't have time for right now, of course. Navraj Singh, Zaya Tong, always good to hear your views. Thanks both very much indeed for joining us tonight. Well, tomorrow I'll be joined by the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute, Alyssa Gilbert, and Professor of Global Change Science at University College London and the University of Leeds, Simon Lewis. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.